Hello everyone, and welcome to Dyalog Webinar number 18. My name is Morten Kromberg, and I'm going to spend the next, hopefully slightly less rather than slightly more than an hour, talking to you about some work we've been doing recently that's supposed to make it easier for you to work with source code, APL source code. The title of the presentation, Source Code Management with Dyalog 17.1, should probably be tweaked a little bit. Because although the link tool that this talk is mostly going to be about has been one of the most important development projects in the version 17.1 development cycle, the tool is actually available for both 17.0 and 17.1. It's available now before the release of 17.1, in fact. So briefly introducing link. Here's a picture of a chain link. And what this link tool does is that it creates a link between APL functions, operators, or in fact could be variables as well, in your active workspace, and source files which contain the definitions of the same APL code. The idea is to move towards an environment where we think of the files as being the source code for APL applications rather than binary workspaces, because that gives us a number of advantages in working with code. We can use tools other than those that have been developed by APL programmers. So link connects items in the active workspace with external source files. What link is actually quite simple. It's a mechanism to load source code into or out of a workspace, and optionally, if you so desire, to keep it synchronized. So if a change is made on one side of the link, it's immediately replicated on the other. So you can think about these two visible implementations of the function or instantiations of a function as the same one. Although the title of the talk is Source Code Management, Link itself is actually not a source code management system. It's not a project management system. It's not a dependency management system. It really only manages these links, but by making sure that your source code is always present in files, it facilitates all of the above. You can use other tools to achieve these things. So if we take a step slightly back, we have the same function on the right now. On the left, we have, rather than just looking at the file, we have a folder full of functions. Link makes sure that this synchronization takes place, and then you can use other tools like Git or Subversion to manage these source files, keep them in a source code repository, and so on. And you can use continuous integration tools to create, build, and test environments, take advantage of all the modern tools available for source code management, editors, and so on. And link is just providing this link between what's in the workspace and the source files. Right, let's dive straight in. Being APLers, we'd rather see it in action. That's enough PowerPoint slides at least to begin with. So here is an APL session. Let's see, maybe increase the font size slightly. And as you can see, I've preloaded a workspace called WN18A, Webinar 18A. And it contains a function called birth weekdays, which takes as its argument a year, month, and date. And then on the left-hand side, how many years you want a result for. And it then tells you for the next 3 years on which weekday the birthday will fall in that year. And it's doing it in Danish. Happens to be doing it in Danish. If we open up the Workspace Explorer and take a look at what's in this workspace, I'm just wondering if this is large enough. What do you say, guys? Should I increase the... No, 125 should be. I'm going to stick with that unless somebody complains. So if we look at what's in the workspace, there's one function which is our application code, if you like. And as you can see, it refers to day names which is this variable containing the names of the days which have been translated into Danish in this version of the application. And then you'll notice that the function also calls in the date-time namespace a function called weekday. So we have a date-time namespace containing utility functions related to dates, and we're calling this one called weekday to translate the year, month, date into a number giving us the day of the week, and then we translate that. So this is how you would traditionally work with it. You'd load the workspace, you'd do your stuff, and then you'd save the workspace. But what we're going to do now for the next 45 minutes or so is work on turning this into a folder full of files and showing some of the advantages of doing that. So I'm going to use a user command which is available in 17.1 and which you can install retroactively into 17.0. And I'm going to say link the root of my namespace to a folder called WN18 Webinar 18 BW Day app, birth weekday app. And before I hit enter, I'm going to bring up File Explorer so we can see that folder here, WN18. And you'll notice that when I hit enter on that, we immediately have this BWD app appear. And in there we have the functions. So this is a folder structure that is parallel to the namespace structure in the workspace. So the date time namespace is there with all the functions. They're in files with the extension .aplf. And in the root we have the birth weekdays, and we can see that that is in fact, we have a preview here, we can see what that function looks like. Now, one problem that the observant viewer will have noticed is that the variable is not there, right? We have this day names variable, and it was not moved into the folder by link create. We've taken the decision, until further notice at least, that we don't feel comfortable moving all variables out. We don't know which variables should be considered source code rather than data. So at the moment you need to call a function in the link namespace. So link is available both as user commands, as the one I typed a few lines further up, but also as a set of APIs. And we really do recommend that, at least if you're writing code, you use the APIs. So we're going to say, well, add day names explicitly, and you immediately see that a daynames.apla for APL array appears here. If we open that with a popular text editor like Notepad++, we can see the experimental array notation. We still consider this notation for arrays to be experimental. We're releasing it in link, and we're hoping that people will play with it for a year or so. If they like it, we'll probably commit it into the APL interpreter. But we're keeping it written in APL until further notice. So now we have exported all of our code and the data which should be considered part of the source code of the application, the constants. And if we clear the workspace, we'll close the Explorer, and then we simply repeat that statement, link create hash and the name of the folder. The default for link create is to look at the contents of these two points that have been identified, a namespace and a folder, and copy in one direction or the other, or indeed synchronize them if there's stuff in both directions. So we've done that from a clear workspace. If we open the Workspace Explorer, we can see that everything has come back, including the variable, and we can test our function. Oops. Yes, go to the, there's a comment here, hooray, two-dimensional array notation. For those of you who haven't seen this array notation, Adam Brudzewski made a presentation at last year's Dyalog conference presenting the current model for the notation, which is what's implemented here. Right, so if we now edit a function, we said this is going to be synchronized, so I'll throw in a comment here. Morten was here. we go and click on this and see the preview in the Windows Explorer, we can see that that comment is there immediately. If I create a function foo, you will see that it immediately appears here. Foo function is immediately, a file is immediately created. The system is able to figure out which folder it should go into. Right, so that was the first phase. We've managed to get all of the contents of our workspace, both our application code and the utility that we were working on, into a file folder. Now, of course, the immediate problem we have is that this date time thing isn't actually part of our application code. It's part of a utility library that everybody in the company is using also for other applications. So it isn't actually a good idea that it's here in our application. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to cut and paste it here in the, I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to move it up to a higher level so that it's in a parallel structure. So now date time is parallel to my application, because it should really be thought of as a separate folder of code. And if I now link create again, of course I only have this code, and I need to do another create and say that this time the target is the date time folder, and the file that I'm bringing stuff in from is this. And now we're back where we were before, but we had to do 2 link creates because we brought in two separate things. Now, of course, that gets a bit tedious. So as soon as you start splitting things up into folders, you're likely to want to write a little function to bring in everything that you want into your application. And I'm not going to write all this. I've pre-cooked a few things. So I'm going to bring in, from my builders folder, I'm going to bring in build A, except at the moment you have to remember to put the extension on. I think we may change that. If I change, I don't want it to be called build A, I want it to be called build, so I'll just rename it and erase build A. And then I'll run it. So I'll say build, and I'll give it my folder name, bwd app, and I'll trace that. So what it does is it figures out what the parent folder is, because it's expecting the dependencies to be in folders, sibling folders, and then it calls quadrc.link.create instead of using the user command, and it does it again for the date time thing, and it returns then the result. Yeah. So now, let's see, call one of these. Let's do 4. What happened here? That's a bit strange. I should have had all the functions here. This worked 3 times while I was preparing. What have I screwed up? Let me try again. Bring in the function. Doesn't matter how many times you rehearse these things. Oh, I see. Okay, see what happened. This is actually very useful. It's one of the gotchas on one of the slides at the end. You see, I mistyped the folder name there. And one of the problems that we have at the moment, which I think is a design thing we might want to change, is that if you do a link create and you say you want to copy stuff bidirectionally, it's okay that the folder name doesn't exist. That just copies everything you have in the workspace, as we did in the very first example when we were creating the repository. So you don't get an error message. It just copies everything out into the folder. So there we go. You have to remember to type the folder names correctly. Yep, so it's all working, although we've now split our own application code and the utility code into a different folder, and we've written this function. And now some of you may be saying, well, I thought you said this wasn't a project management system or a dependency management system. And it isn't. Link is neither of those. You could say that this build function that we've written is a dependency management system or a project management system. But at the moment you have to write it yourself, or you have to go and look at Acre Desktop, which is a tool that uses very similar, uses source code using the same file extensions a very similar way, and in time will be based on Link, we hope. If you actually want something to a project management system, or you write these small functions that I'll be writing a few more of today. So we've separated our code into two folders. But of course, I know there's a user command called linked list where we can see that we have these two folders. It's when you have nested namespaces here, datetime is inside hash, the item counts that you get aren't entirely reliable. Now you notice that function foo is still there and we don't really want it. And you might think you could type erase foo and have it go away. But the linking mechanism is currently only hooked into the editor. When you edit something and you leave the editor, the synchronization kicks in and updates stuff. So if you want to remove something, you actually have to call, at the moment, a function called expunge. And if you look at the folder on the left as I hit enter here, you'll see the foo file disappear. So again, same way, if we make a namespace called foos, you notice no folder appeared on the left here because that system command creating a namespace doesn't have any hooks into the system. But if we create a function foo inside foos, then the instant we come out of the editor, the callback kicks in and the system notices that it needs to create now a namespace called foos, and inside there the function foo. So all of the synchronization from the APL interpreter going out is currently hooked into the act of leaving the editor, or you have functions called expunge or fix to inform Link that these changes have been made. Again, that's something that may get folded into the interpreter later, but hasn't been done yet. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to, before I do anything else and risk accidentally deleting my work, I'd like to create a Git repository to store it in. So I'm going to go to GitHub, where I have an account. We're not going to talk about how to do that. It's fairly straightforward. The reason I use GitHub is it's by far the easiest way to get repositories working and have them accessible from all the machines that you use, virtual machines running Linux and so on and so forth. It's extremely convenient. So I'm going to go to my repositories here. I'm going to create a repository called BWD, Birth Weekdays, Demo Repository. We choose whether it's public or private. In this case, public. If it's private, only you can see it. It's usually a good idea to initialize it with a README, and it's polite to pick a license. I think virtually everything we do at Dyalog in APL and put on GitHub uses the MIT license, which means basically anybody can use the stuff as they please. Click Create Repository. And we now have a repository on GitHub with two files in it. There's a license, which is the MIT license saying free of charge, anybody obtaining copy can do whatever they like. And there's the README file that just has what we typed into that one field and can of course be extended. And I'm now going to clone that repository on my machine. So I'm going to type Git. I'm not going to show how to install Git again. That's beyond the scope of this presentation. I assume you can find out how to download it and install it. I'm going to clone, and you have to give the HTTP address github.com/mkromberg/bwd. And what that does is it creates a folder called bwd. If we have a look in there, we'll see that it contains the license text and the README that we saw on the website. And I'm now going to copy all of the files that I have that we created in the little app folder using quad n copy. I'm going to say into webinar 18 bwd quad n copy variant. I don't type variant enough to remember how to type it. What? Yeah, Control-Shift/, you say, but not on a Danish keyboard, I don't think. So I'm going to copy everything from bwd app, which was where we saved everything earlier, into this bwd folder. So if we now look in bwd, we'll see that all of our source code has gone in there. And then I'm going to cd into bwd, and I'm going to say, oh, actually, let's test that it works first. So we have a clear workspace, link, import the build function, bwd build APLF, and then we will run it, giving the new folder name as the argument. It loads bwd, the code still brings in date time, which of course is not in a GitHub repository, it's still in a parallel folder, and we can get birthdays. It still all works. So we now want to commit this back to the GitHub repository, and that requires a few commands that you need to just learn. They're not very complicated. And I'll show you how you can avoid remembering how to type them in a few moments. You say add the contents of the current folder, anything that's changed, git commit, and the hard part is you have to think of a message, my first commit, and then you have to say, so what that does is it commits to a repository that's on your local machine, and that gives you the ability to roll backwards and forwards and work on your own. But if you want to let everybody else see it, you have to do a git push, where you have to identify yourself to the GitHub server. If we now go back to here, we'll see that we now have two commits. We have all of the code up here, and you can it's actually readable on the web page. We can look at the commits. We can see that this last one, my first commit, there were three pieces of code that were uploaded in addition to the license and the README that were there. There's the birth week days, the build function, the variable. Oh, and foo is still there. Foo is still there. Yep. So what we've done now is that we've put all of our own source code into this GitHub repository, and we'll look at what advantages that gives us in a moment. Now, of course, the date time thing is still not in a repository, and of course we remember that the company has, in fact, there is a date time repository already on GitHub, we've remembered. So there's mkromberg date time, and there's an APL source folder there that has all of those functions in it. And so what we should do to get that synchronized is to delete this datetime folder that we have, bravely, and then go back to our root here and say git clone https github.com mkromberg date time. And now, instead of that copy that we happen to have in our workspace, we're working with the official company utility library date time. Except that the folder structure is slightly different. Before it was just in date time, and now there's a subfolder called APL source. So we need to make a slight change to our build function. So I'm going to go and get hold of the repository WN18 BWD is where it all is, and then I'm going to go and get a new function from builders, the build B function, and I'm going to edit build B and call it build. Erase build B, and then we're going to call build B and see how it's different. Oops. No, it's not called build B, it's called build. So build is also calling link create twice, but in this case it's providing each call with a left argument, which is a namespace containing options. So we get hold of the parent folder as before, and then we create an options namespace, and into it we say that we want the source to be the directory, so we don't want to accidentally pick up anything that was in the workspace. We only want to copy stuff from the folders into the workspace when we do the build. And then we can decide whether we want synchronization to happen in one direction or both directions. So for our main application, we want synchronization to go in both directions. If we make a change outside or inside, we want it synchronized. And that was a bit of a surprise. I got a compliment for my quick recovery before. Why did that happen? Oh. All right. So what happened here was that because I said I'd copied the build function into this workspace, but I had not edited it. So when we then ran the link create and said consider what's in the folder to be the source, that immediately overwrote the function that we were running. So I'm going to have to bring it in again, and I'm going to edit it. I'm going to change its name. I'm going to erase build B. And this is the new one. I'll put a comment here. Let me just check. I'm not sure exactly why. Yeah, this is the new one. I was actually expecting when I renamed it that to overwrite the source. We may have a slight issue there, but anyway, now it's there. If I now call it again, so we say for the main folder, which is our application code, we want the watching to go both ways. But for this dependency, which is the date time folder where we're getting the APL source in, we've set watch to none. So that means we don't want any form of synchronization there. We want that to be static after we've brought it into the workspace. Yeah. And if we now have a look at the result of linked list extended, we can see that we have two links. We have one to our own application code, which has 3 items that are synchronized and we're watching in both directions. And then we have the date time folder, which came from here, but where there's no synchronization going on. So we've decided in our build function how we want this, these two pieces of code to be handled differently. And hopefully the code is still working. Yes. Today is a Thursday. And just to demonstrate that this is correct, Morten was here again. It's working correctly. I mean, if we have a look here, we can see that Morten was here again. If we edit date time.now and we say Morten was here, and we go to have a look at date time Apple source. Now we can see that that was not updated. So the system is updating what we want, and it's not updating the other stuff. Right. So let's see, what have we got left to tidy up here? See, we've got that foos folder that we don't really want. So let's, so we could either update the, or we could get rid of the namespace in the workspace, but actually the synchronization includes namespaces and their contents. So if I just go to the folder here and I delete foos, we can see that the namespace is gone. So the synchronization is fairly complete. And I've certainly found in my own experience that there are very many types of refactoring and reorganization of the workspace where it's actually easier to manipulate stuff by moving things around in the folders. Okay, I'm being asked to speak up. I'm a little bit surprised because there's this gigantic microphone stuck right in my nose. But I'll try to do that. Apologies to those who are having trouble hearing me. Okay, so one of the big advantages I find is using Git and GitHub. And there's a tool I found recently that I found really increases the value I'm getting from having my APL code in source files. And that's a tool called VS Code, which is originally, I think VS stands for Visual Studio, but it's an open source tool, free download, easily available. So if I invoke code here on my BWD folder, VS Code opens up, and you can see it immediately gives me an overview of the contents of that folder. I've got birth week days, and you can see after a split second it actually gave me some syntax coloring here. And that's because I've installed into VS Code, which is a very modular architecture, I've installed the APL language plugin, which is something that Gilgamesh Aswaraya has been working on. And it's really quite cool the way they do their plugins. For example, Gil has been able to create these animated examples of how you get snippet completion and syntax highlighting, and he's working on an APL language server that will give pop-up language help and so on. That's still a bit experimental, but it's something that we are committed to working on. So I can look at the folders here. You can see here there's a little picture of a branch with a 3 on it, and what that's telling me is that I have 3 functions that were changed. And if I click on one of those, I can see that I can immediately get a difference between what is committed, what was in the last commit, and what's changed since I got hold of a download from the GitHub server. And this comment change here, I think I'm just going to revert it. I don't think that was meaningful. I'm just going to discard those changes. And if we go back to the APL workspace, because that discard actually changed the file, if I go and look at birth weekdays, we'll see that the again has disappeared from that comment. I can, let's see, I'm happy that the folder has disappeared. It's telling me that the folder has disappeared since we made the change. It's telling me that the build function was also modified. So I decided, I had a look at this code, and being an old Sharp APL guy, I think it would be nicer to use the rank operator here. So instead of the catenate each, I'm going to do a catenate rank 01 of the years and the months and the day, which gives me a 3-column matrix rather than a vector of nested vectors. So it's a simpler data type, uses less space, but then I can't do weekday each. I have to do a weekday rank 1, so I apply weekday to each row of the matrix in that 3-column matrix there. And let's just see that that's still working. Thursday, yeah, today is Thursday, so that's all working well. If we now go back to VS Code, because as soon as we made that code change, it was written to the file, we can see that birth weekdays has again appeared on the list of things that have changed. And we can see that VS Code, although it was written by people who presumably knew nothing about APL, is correctly giving us a very accurate diff here of the exact pieces of each line that have changed when I made that code change. So I'm now going to commit these changes to GitHub. Of course, these two changes are unrelated, so I'm going to stage the build change, and I'm going to say that that was done, let's see, why did we do that? That was done to split the date time into separate folder. I'm going to commit that change. I'm going to stage the birth weekdays change and say I did that because rank is cool. And then this change where we deleted that folder, that was cleanup. So I commit those as separate changes because they're really unrelated. And then I push the 3 changes to GitHub. And if I now go back to the GitHub repository, let's see, BWD, we can see that there are now 5 commits. The one rank is cool just shows this change, and so on and so forth. So this is, even when you're working on your own, I mean, some people will say that you need this kind of tool when you're a team. But I have to say that for my own use, this is invaluable. Being able to track changes in this way is amazing. And in fact, it's even better than that, because you can click on the history. Let's go to birth weekdays, and then you can say, show file history in view. And then you see here, you get the file history, and it says, a minute ago we did rank is cool, and 16 minutes ago we did our first commit. So if we click on the first commit, we see that. If we click on rank is cool, we see that change. If we say, well, I'd like to actually test the behavior of this one, we can right click, checkout. And if we now go back to the APL workspace, we get a pop-up that the file has changed. I'm a little bit surprised by that. I think we may have a little glitch there. But you can see the code has reverted to how it was before I did the rank thing. So I can run the function again. I can see that, yep, returns the same results. I can go back to VS Code, have a look at the staged changes and say, well, actually I think the changes are fine, so unstage them. And in fact, so when they become unstaged, it means they're no longer candidates to be committed. And in fact, I'm going to discard them completely and get back to where I was. And I can sit and move backwards and forwards in this data that I have for the GitHub repository. And in my workspace, we just have the workspace is following along, because what VS Code is doing as it checks different versions out is manipulating the files, and they are immediately synchronized with the workspace. Okay, so that was a little demo of this tool called VS Code, which has actually become a place from which I do about half of my APL coding. Okay, so our product has been out in the field for a little while, and people are playing with it and they think it's nice, but then somebody came along and said they don't like having to type that right argument. They think it would be nice. Can we have a GUI tool to pick the date argument? And they submit that as an issue. So the GitHub repository has this issue system where we can look at all the open issues. So I notice this and I say, yeah, well, I seem to remember that fellow called Josh wrote some tools, CEF utility he called them, a set of simple cross-platform GUI tools for doing simple prompting. And I think he has a date time picker. If we go and look in his APL source, we can see that, oh, there's something there called pick date. That looks good. I'm going to include that in my project. And all I need to do to include that in my project now is to go to this folder here and say, because Josh, when he did that work, he made it as a GitHub repository, I can say git clone https github.com/joshdavid/cef utility. Oh, I think that's capital U. And that creates a folder on my machine called CEF utility. If we have a look inside that, we can see that that's actually one of these Acre projects. Josh has been working with the Acre project management system, and we can tell that because there's an Acre config file in here. If we open that with Notepad, we can see it contains some settings because Acre is a proper project management system that knows about how to load various folders and settings that you might want. But the good news is that the code that we actually want is in this APL source folder. And if we just load that with a link, it doesn't really, we don't need to worry, in this case at least, about the metadata that's there. So in order to make use of this, of course, we need to change our build function again. So let's bring in our core namespace, BWD. Remember the namespace, and then bring in, you'll never guess what the name of this function is. Into the root, we will bring builders build C. As I said earlier, you have to remember the extension. Add build C, call it build, arrays build C. Let me just edit it one more time in case there's some little bugette there. And if I now build with that function, I'll trace it. We can see that we now have 3 lines of link create. And I put in a little, just to show that, you know, you could really get into dependency management in your build function. You could do things like shell out to Git to do the actual clone or check out a specific build ID of your dependencies if you so wanted. But that's not really about link. I'm just showing that you can do that. So we create a link to date time, to CEF utility. So we have that in the workspace, and then I have another thing that, as in TV kitchens, I have written a function. It's in a folder called pre-cooked birth weekday. I'll never get used to this. If Adam is watching, Adam, I really needed to add the extension if I forget to type it. So now you'll notice that I imported a function into the workspace, and if we go and have a look here in BWD, it's called birth weekday singular, not plural. It hasn't appeared here, and that's because we haven't edited it. So we can either edit it and then the system will realize that it's there, or we can call this add function and say, by the way, this thing has appeared in the workspace that you don't know about. Please add it, and then it's added to the files. So let's see what that can do. Trace through it. It's using this CEF utility. Josh has created some cascading style sheet data that gives a nice look. We're not going to go into that. I get a bit tired of typing CEF utility.user functions, so I'm making a shortcut for that, just called HTML funs. Then I create a parameter namespace with a title, enter date of birth, a size, and I specify the CSS. And then I call the pickDate function with the parameters as the left argument and a prompt as the right argument. And that brings up this thing using the HTML renderer. I can pick a date, I submit it, I have a date back, and then we call birth week days, create some HTML, and then instead of using Josh's utility, we just create an HTML renderer object explicitly putting in this HTML caption of happy birthdays and specifying a size. So we'll just let that run now. We get the result and we're done. So thanks to GitHub, we managed to quickly import somebody else's tools and bring them into our application and use them. A question has come in whether link supplants salt. And I think the answer to that is that yes, salt has been around for 7-8 years and maybe 10, and was our first stab at this. And link is what we are creating based on the experience of doing salt. So salt isn't going to disappear immediately. It still has some features that are not in link. It's better at dealing explicitly with individual objects in a workspace, where link really is about linking a folder to a namespace. So there may be uses of salt for some time yet, but over time we expect link to become the tool that replaces salt and gradually get built more and more into the interpreter. At the moment, a lot of link is written in APL, but more and more of that is going to disappear into the interpreter. So just a final piece of the demo. Well, it's hardly really a demo. Obviously, if you're going to be doing this, loading this workspace all the time, importing build and using it, then it's a nice thing to do to bring in build once. Link import into the root bwd build. I'll never learn this. Set quadlex to be build CWN18 bwd. or if you're clever, have it determine that from the workspace ID. Save this as a workspace. So there's still use for the workspace for a while yet. Let's call this BWD dev. So I now have a BWD dev workspace, which if I click on it, it brings in all the source code. And really would recommend that you don't save workspace, don't save any more than the build function in a workspace. And in fact, we see it as a problem to be eliminated, that you need the build workspace. You should be able to launch APL on the build function directly and have it build your environment without having to save a workspace. It's a current weakness of the system that you really, in practice, will need to have this workspace. Okay, so that's the demo, and get back to the PowerPoints. This is actually a screenshot. So this is my Linux virtual machine. Just to show that I started a Linux virtual machine, and then I typed these 3 git clone statements: git clone BWD, date time, and CEF utility. And Git and VS Code and Dyalog APL are all available and work pretty much the same way, including the HTML renderer now on Windows, Mac, and Linux. So having done those 3 git clones, I can link import the build function and run it, and you can see the birth week day working. So questions come in to say, how is Link's performance with really large workspaces? I think the best answer we have to that is we have one client who has 90,000 functions, and if they load them all at once, it takes a couple of minutes, I think, between 1 and 2 minutes. One of the things we're working on is we have a technology called shared code files, where you can store functions in a file which can be memory mapped into a workspace or into an active workspace more or less instantaneously. And we're hoping that we'll be able to include in that the link metadata. So you could in fact create one of these shared code files with all the link information of where the source for the functions are, and the loading would then become more or less instantaneous, even though you have the link functionality. But that isn't quite there yet. So where we are with Link right now, Link requires 17 or 17.1. And at the moment where we are in beta testing of 17.1, every new build that we make and distribute to people includes the latest code. We're just taking the head of the Link repository. One thing which is a little bit different from most Dyalog tools is that we've decided to experiment with this open source project. So everything, all the support and updates are handled via GitHub. Although, of course, if you're paying Dyalog for support, you're always welcome to send support queries just to support@dyalog.com. If you're not comfortable with putting your questions or problems out in public on the GitHub repository, we will accept requests. But we're trying to see how it works, whether we can get also community involvement in the coding on this. So this is a screenshot of the GitHub repository where you can see the top level of the Link repository. There's a wiki where most of the documentation for Link is actually on the wiki and the Git repository. So there's some tutorial material, and then there's the API reference with a page for every one of the functions. All of the issues at the moment are publicly viewable, so we can see here, this is a snapshot from earlier today or yesterday of the 12 open issues. And if anybody out there is using Classic, you can see that if something doesn't work on Classic, we're accepting that as a bug, and we're trying to keep Link working with Classic as well. There's 61 closed issues. GitHub, of course, provides all sorts of insights, so we can see here who's doing the work. There's a picture of Adam there, and The Imperial cruisers colliding is my GitHub avatar. There's even little activity reports where you can see exactly when the work was done, when the commits were made, how many lines of code were changed, and so on. And let's see, we've seen have we seen most of these user commands? We've seen create, import, we saw expunge, list. Break is one where you say you want to break the links. You might do that before you saved a runtime workspace. Or if you wanted to make sure that none of the changes you made in the workspace were synchronized back. You might want to break the link to stop that from happening under certain circumstances. So there's these are the user commands. The API has a few more functions. Some of them were not really relevant as user commands. Once version 17.1 is in production, the production builds will include selected stable commits from the repository. We won't just be grabbing the latest commits anymore, but people who want to stay on the leading edge and maybe participate will be able to use the repository to stay synchronized. So Link is in daily use now by a small but rapidly growing group of users. We do need to say though that although it works well in the scenarios people have been using, it is likely that if you start, you port your application to Link, you may uncover issues we haven't looked at. Some of the things what we would say, the things that are really well supported are if you have workspaces with non-overlapping links. So you're just linking namespaces or just hash the root of your namespace to a folder. We know that this works really well. And in the demo, if you noticed, I was linking both the root and a sub namespace, and that was working quite well. You just need to be careful of a couple of things. If you do have overlaps, we recommend that you only read code in from the folder when you create the links, because otherwise it can get quite confusing. And there's a function called link refresh, which is something you can use if you suspect that the workspace and the folders are out of sync. You really shouldn't use link refresh if you have overlapping namespaces, because things can get quite interesting if you do. So our recommendation is that as we were doing finally here, start from a clear workspace with a build function or something that creates the links that you want. Do your work there. Maybe create a runtime workspace with the links broken, which is what you actually ship to your users, but don't save workspaces. So the things that you should avoid for now are these overlapping link namespaces. We've talked about what you need to do if you have them. We ask that you not call the link user commands under program control. It's possible to call any user command under program control with quadse.ucmd. We ask that you call the API file functions directly. And one thing you really want to avoid at the moment is to save workspaces with active links, shut down your APL, and then expect to load the workspace and have the links working. That will not work. That is one of the top things that we want to do to work on. There's a question from Ray about linking things into quadse. I think that should work. There's no reason why that should not work. It's not something that's been tested a lot, but of course link itself is in quadse. So we are using the technology ourselves for that. So there's a question from Charles, what are overlapping namespaces? Well, that doesn't really, maybe that's a bad term I've used. I suppose we should say, if you link a namespace and its children or its parents, so one namespace is inside another, which of course is always the case if you link hash. Then it's not clear exactly what you want. So ideally you would divide your workspace up into separate namespaces to have things crystal clear. But we recognize that a lot of people are going to want to have maybe the bulk of their code in the root of the workspace and have sub namespaces. So we are trying to get that to work as reliably and predictably as possible. And I think in the demo today I didn't get into any trouble with that. At the moment, really just stay away from this link refresh thing if you have that situation. Let's see, we are now actually at the hour is up, so I need to conclude really quickly. I've listed a couple of gotchas here. As I think we saw, if you have these nested namespaces, I'll use that term, then the numbers reported by link list and link break are not very accurate because there's some double counting going on. I managed to demonstrate that if you use link create with source both and you mistype the directory name, you confuse yourself because you don't get an error message, but instead of loading stuff into the workspace, an empty directory was created. And we've decided to change the default for link create to be source equals directory, in which case you will get an error message if the directory doesn't exist. And variables or functions operators that arrive in the workspace through other means than the editor, you need to use these functions add or fix if you redefine a function under program control to let the link system know that they've changed. Again, that may get slicker as link becomes integrated more with the interpreter. Our short-term to-do list is to change this default. So the source is to bring stuff in. We think that's the 99% use case. People are going to be using link create to bring stuff in from outside. After all, outside is where the source should be. We need some kind of command to break all links. And we need to make link refresh more capable. At the moment, it's not sufficiently sensitive to things that might have changed on both sides. It just recreates the link, breaks it and recreates it. And there's a performance problem with clear. In the longer term, we recognize that people are going to want to save workspaces to save the state of something they're working on. Go off and do something else, reload the workspace and resume work, and we do want to get that to work. And as I mentioned, one of the goals is clearly that you should be able to have applications that are launched entirely from source files. So you don't need a workspace at all to run an application. You might decide that that's how you ship your application in a workspace, but during development and testing you shouldn't need workspaces. And the final thing here is we do want to make it easier for people to make calls to Git if they want to do cloning or checkouts from inside APL rather than shelling out. There's a library called libgit2 which is cross-platform, which is in our sites. So to conclude, although it's still very new and being worked on, you've seen the rate of commits. Link is going to be a core component, or it is a core component, but it's going to be something that's used for a lot of things in the future. We're totally convinced of that. The Link and the Acre teams have been working together to agree on standards for file naming and content, and we think Acre is likely to become the recommended project management tool for all new Dyalog projects, at least small ones that don't need sort of integration with other corporate stuff. And at the moment there's a special offer if you start working on this quickly. While our resources last, we will invite you to do some screen sharing with Adam or myself to help you get started with this, because we're very interested in seeing new scenarios and understanding what might need to be adapted. Right, so source code management helped by link. The idea is simply you use ordinary Unicode text files, you use industry standard tools to do the actual source code management or other integration tasks, and we're trying to make absolutely sure that you don't lose any of the dynamic nature of APL debugging and development. You can use the tracer and the editor in APL exactly the same way you did before. The advantage is just that your source code can be accessed and manipulated using a bunch of really, really good tools that now exist. If you want to learn more about this, there's the wiki in particular on the link repository. We highly recommend that you take a look at the Acre Desktop repository. That doesn't currently use link, but we're hoping that it'll soon do so, and it's fundamentally compatible, as we saw in the demo. Come to Dyalog 19. There'll be talks and workshops on this. And there's a few things we didn't talk about, and we still overran. I apologize for that. And anybody who had to leave and is watching this as a catching up, watching the recording. And that's all I had to say. Come back in a month. Richard Park will be doing the next webinar on molecular dynamics in Dyalog APL. And we will now have a break for a minute or two to see if there are any final questions, or I've overrun and everybody has evaporated. So this is the awkward silence while we wait for questions. I realized the demo had a lot of moving parts, but there is a fair amount of material to cover. Any advice on how to do this again at the Dyalog user meeting will be gratefully received. No questions. Well, it's getting close to nearly all working, so I think all the errors were mine. And we'll see you in a month. Richard will be here. Thank you very much. Goodbye.